The airport buzzed with the rhythm of departures, announcements echoing across marble floors, the smell of jet fuel faintly drifting in from the tarmac. She stood near the gate, ticket in hand, neatly dressed and calm, her eyes scanning the display board that flickered with delayed flights and updated gate numbers. It had been a long week, long enough to earn a little comfort on the way home. Her miles qualified her for an upgrade, or at least they should have. She'd applied days before, her record clean, her loyalty to the airline unquestioned. But as she approached the counter, a sense of unease crept into her chest, something subtle and unexplainable. The gate agent looked up with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. The line behind her was restless, filled with impatient travelers scrolling through their phones, business suits and vacation shirts blending into a blur. When it was her turn, she handed over her boarding pass, her voice calm but hopeful. "I was told there might be a first-class seat available. I confirmed the request yesterday." The agent's manicured fingers tapped across the keyboard, the rhythmic clacking filling the pause that followed. Her expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a small frown, then a shrug. "I'm sorry, ma'am," she said finally, her tone polite but rehearsed. "It seems your upgrade didn't go through. First class is full." The words felt heavier than they should have. Full. Denied. She glanced past the counter toward the boarding area where sharply dressed passengers sipped coffee and scrolled through tablets, unaware of her quiet rejection. She'd earned the miles, the priority, the respect, but in that instant, none of it seemed to matter. The agent's voice continued, too cheerful to be genuine. "You're still in a good seat, just a few rows back from first class." She nodded, forcing a small smile. There was no use arguing. The man in line behind her cleared his throat impatiently, his suit jacket brushing her arm as he stepped forward. She stepped aside, letting him take her place, her fingers tightening around the boarding pass. Somewhere deep inside, a flicker of disappointment stirred, but she pushed it down. She wasn't the type to make a scene. As she moved away from the counter, her eyes caught a brief reflection in the glass, her own calm face, framed by the pale light of the terminal, surrounded by strangers rushing toward their gates. It wasn't about the seat, not really. It was about what it represented, the quiet reminder that sometimes effort and status meant little in the face of arbitrary decisions made by people who didn't know your story. She found a seat by the window, setting her small carry-on beside her. The view outside showed the aircraft waiting at the gate, silver wings gleaming beneath the setting sun, engines humming faintly as ground crew moved like shadows around it. She checked her phone, scrolling through unread messages. One from her sister, another from work. Nothing that would change the fact that she'd be spending the next 6 hours in economy. Around her, boarding announcements filled the air, echoing through the waiting area. Families gathered their children, business travelers straightened their jackets, and the air grew thicker with anticipation. The gate agent's voice returned, bright and confident, calling first-class passengers first. They rose gracefully, as if choreographed, walking past the rest with the quiet assurance that comes with privilege. She watched them file through the jet bridge, one by one, until her boarding group was called. Her section, toward the middle of the plane. She rose slowly, collected her bag, and joined the line of passengers stretching down the carpeted walkway. The air grew cooler near the plane door, a faint metallic scent mixing with recycled air. A uniformed flight attendant smiled mechanically, greeting each passenger in turn. "Welcome aboard," she said, the same phrase on repeat, her eyes already moving to the next person. She found her seat, stowed her bag, and sat down by the window. The hum of the engines was distant but constant, a reminder of the world waiting beyond the glass. She glanced through the small oval window toward the front of the plane where a narrow curtain separated first class from the rest. For a brief second, she thought she saw a flash of movement, a pilot stepping into the cabin, his uniform sharp, his stride confident. She couldn't see his face, only the golden insignia on his shoulders catching the dim light. Around her, passengers settled in, adjusting seatbelts and opening magazines. A man beside her made a joke about the lack of legroom, and she smiled politely, though her thoughts were elsewhere. It wasn't bitterness that filled her, just a quiet curiosity, why her name hadn't been on that upgrade list. Maybe it was an error, maybe just luck. But a part of her couldn't shake the feeling that the story of this flight was far from over. The intercom crackled to life as the captain's voice came through, calm and professional. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is your captain speaking. We're expecting a smooth flight tonight." The usual briefing followed: cruising altitude, weather updates, estimated arrival. But there was something in his tone, a quiet authority beneath the calm, that made her look up. She couldn't explain it, but something about his voice seemed familiar. Not from the airline, not from television or some announcement. Familiar in a deeper way, the kind of voice that carried command, precision, and quiet strength. She listened closely as he finished his announcement, unaware that before this flight would land, their paths would cross in a way that would leave every passenger on that plane with a story they would never forget. The boarding gate slowly emptied as passengers disappeared into the jet bridge one by one. She remained seated for a moment longer, her eyes fixed on the quiet rhythm of people moving forward, the confident stride of those in first class, the weary shuffle of those at the back. Her boarding group had already been called, but she didn't rush. Something about the way the gate agent had smiled earlier still lingered in her mind. It hadn't been unkind, but it carried that familiar tone, the kind that said you don't belong here, even without words. When she finally stood, her boarding pass felt lighter than it should have, a flimsy piece of paper that had somehow come to represent the entire hierarchy of the modern world. She walked past the counter again, the same agent busy scanning the next passenger's ticket, offering bright politeness without meaning behind it. Their eyes didn't meet this time. She stepped into the jet bridge, the hum of the plane's engines vibrating faintly through the metal floor beneath her shoes. The air grew cooler as she approached the open aircraft door. The cabin lights glowed a soft gold, a warmth that contrasted sharply with the sterile brightness of the terminal. A flight attendant greeted her, her professional smile as practiced as the one at the counter. "Welcome aboard." The words were the same for everyone, but they didn't feel the same. Some passengers got an extra note of familiarity, a touch of admiration for their platinum status or business attire. Hers was just polite, nothing more. She nodded silently and stepped inside. The narrow aisle stretched ahead of her, the dividing curtain just a few steps away. She glanced briefly into the first-class cabin: wide seats, soft lighting, champagne already poured. A man in a tailored suit laughed softly as he handed his coat to a flight attendant. She didn't linger. It wasn't her place anymore. She moved down the aisle, her carry-on brushing against armrests as she made her way to row 17. The seat beside her was empty for now, though the row behind buzzed with the chatter of two travelers comparing business trips. As she settled in, fastening her seatbelt, she could still feel the quiet sting of what had happened at the gate. It wasn't about entitlement. She had earned that upgrade through miles, long nights, and constant travel. It was about the small, invisible moments of judgment that often went unnoticed. The way the gate agent's eyes had flicked briefly to her clothes before delivering the decision. The way another passenger behind her had smirked slightly when she was told first class was full. None of them knew who she was, or what she had endured to stand there so composed. Outside the window, the runway lights flickered in long, glowing lines stretching into the dark horizon. She leaned back, watching the reflection of her face faintly mirrored in the glass. There was nothing to be done now. The decision was made, and she would live with it. Still, something about the interaction kept echoing in her head. The subtle tone that said you're not the kind of person we expect here. It wasn't loud or cruel, but it was sharp enough to leave a mark. The flight attendants moved down the aisle, checking seatbelts and overhead bins. The captain's voice came through the speakers, calm and firm. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard. We'll be taking off shortly." The usual safety briefing followed, but she barely listened. She focused on the voice, steady, confident, and somehow different. It didn't sound like a commercial pilot rehearsing a script. There was weight in it, precision, the tone of someone used to command. As the plane began to taxi, she exhaled slowly. The lights outside blurred into streaks of gold and white. The engines roared to life, pressing her gently into the seat as the aircraft accelerated down the runway. For a moment, the earlier sting of humiliation seemed far away. The world outside tilted, clouds swallowing the view as they climbed higher into the night sky. The man seated beside her finally arrived just before takeoff, dropping into the seat with a casual apology. He was polite but distracted, immediately pulling out his laptop. She gave him a small nod, then turned her gaze back to the window. The stars above the wing glimmered faintly through the thin layer of atmosphere. She didn't know why, but she found herself thinking again of that voice, the pilot's tone, measured and unshaken. Somewhere near cruising altitude, the flight attendants began serving drinks. She declined politely, preferring silence over small talk. The cabin lights dimmed to a soft amber glow. The curtain separating first class from the rest of the plane swayed gently with the turbulence. She imagined the calm up there, the wide seats, the quiet hum of conversation, the comfort she'd been denied. But under the calm exterior, something else began to stir, a faint mix of embarrassment and defiance. Maybe it wasn't the seat that bothered her. Maybe it was the principle, the idea that someone had looked at her and decided, in an instant, where she did or didn't belong. That thought lingered longer than she wanted it to. She didn't know that the decision made at that gate would soon take on a meaning far beyond travel privileges or airline policies. She shifted slightly in her seat, adjusting her jacket, unaware that just beyond that curtain sat a pilot who would soon change everything she thought she knew about judgment, recognition, and the quiet power of dignity. The flight had been calm for nearly 2 hours, the hum of the engines steady, the cabin lights dimmed to a soft golden glow that wrapped the passengers in an artificial sense of peace. The woman sat quietly by the window, her gaze fixed on the dark expanse outside, where streaks of lightning flickered far away in the distance. The rhythmic sound of air rushing over the fuselage created a strange kind of comfort, steady, predictable, almost hypnotic. Around her, most passengers had settled into silence. Some slept, others watched movies or scrolled through their phones, and the occasional chime of a call button broke the monotony. Everything felt routine until it didn't. It began subtly, a faint vibration beneath the floor, a shift so small that at first no one noticed. The overhead lights flickered once, then steadied. A few passengers looked up, curious but unconcerned. She felt it though, that small disruption in rhythm. It wasn't turbulence, it was something else. Her instincts told her the air had changed, the hum of the engines carrying a different pitch now, lower, strained. A few seconds later, the intercom crackled to life, but instead of the calm voice of the captain, there was only static. Then came the first sign that something was truly wrong. A brief flash outside the window, not lightning this time, but something mechanical, reflective. A sound followed, sharp and metallic, like a jolt running through the spine of the aircraft. Passengers gasped. The man seated beside her lifted his head abruptly, pulling out his earbuds. "What was that?" he asked, his tone more nervous than he wanted it to sound. The flight attendants exchanged quick glances, their practiced smiles replaced by something quieter, something that resembled worry. Moments later, the captain's voice returned, calm but clipped, words chosen carefully. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're experiencing a minor technical issue. Please remain seated and keep your seatbelts fastened." Minor technical issue. The phrase was designed to soothe, but it rarely ever meant something small. She could hear the tightness beneath the words, a strain that betrayed more than the captain wanted to reveal. The lights dimmed slightly, and the steady hum of the engines grew uneven for a moment before stabilizing again. The aircraft began to descend slightly, not sharply, but noticeably enough for stomachs to shift and eyes to widen. Murmurs spread through the cabin like ripples across water. "Are we landing?" someone whispered. "We're not even halfway there," another replied. The woman said nothing, just watched the flight attendants as they moved briskly down the aisle, whispering to one another in tones too low to catch. Through the window, the darkness outside had deepened, clouds swirling thickly below them. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled, faint but ominous. The plane steadied again, though the tension in the air refused to settle. Her heartbeat matched the rhythm of the turbulence that followed. Small dips, subtle shifts, the kind that told you something wasn't right even when everyone tried to pretend it was. The intercom came alive again, this time with the co-pilot's voice. "We're making a temporary course adjustment due to weather interference," he said, though she could hear it. That same edge of restraint, the hint of urgency carefully disguised as professionalism. She glanced at the man beside her, who forced a chuckle and muttered, "Weather. Always weather." But no one really believed it. Minutes stretched into an uneasy silence. The cabin crew stopped serving drinks. The aisle lights dimmed further, leaving only the soft glow from the windows and the flicker of screens. A mother held her child a little tighter, a businessman closed his laptop, and the atmosphere thickened with collective unease. It wasn't panic, not yet, just that quiet, suffocating awareness that something beyond their control was happening. Then, almost imperceptibly, the plane tilted again. Not a turn, not turbulence, a deliberate shift in direction. She could feel it in her bones. The engines changed tone once more, and she saw it. The flashing reflection of light from the wing outside, followed by a faint orange glow near the engine that shouldn't have been there. Her breath caught. She wasn't an expert, but she knew that glow wasn't normal. The flight attendants moved faster now, their whispers sharper. Suddenly, the cockpit door opened slightly, just enough for one of the crew to slip in and out. A piece of paper passed hands, a hushed exchange, then the door closed again. The tension rippled through the crew like electricity, spreading silently to the passengers who watched every movement with anxious eyes. A low, distorted alarm beeped from somewhere near the back of the cabin, brief but unmistakable. The man beside her swore under his breath. "That's not weather." She didn't answer. Her eyes were on the cockpit door, where a shadow moved behind the frosted glass. Fast, purposeful. The pilot's voice returned a final time, steady but firmer now. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated. We have the situation under control." The phrase echoed through the cabin, calm and rehearsed, yet the silence that followed felt heavier than any scream. The woman sat back slowly, her fingers gripping the armrest, her gaze locked on the aisle ahead. She could feel every heartbeat, every vibration of the aircraft beneath her. Outside, lightning cracked again, illuminating the clouds in white flashes that swallowed the horizon. Somewhere deep inside the aircraft's frame, metal groaned faintly. The air was thick with unspoken fear, but what none of them knew, not yet, was that the issue wasn't mechanical at all. It was human. A coded message had just come through the cockpit radio, one that didn't belong to civilian frequencies, one that demanded a response only a soldier would understand. The storm outside was nothing compared to the one that had just begun inside. The turbulence had settled, but the air inside the cabin still carried that electric charge of unease, the kind that no announcement could truly erase. The woman kept her eyes fixed on the cockpit door, her instincts whispering what logic refused to accept. Something wasn't right. The captain's voice had been too calm, too careful. Years of discipline could polish tone and posture, but fear had its own sound, and she'd heard it before. Not in civilian life, but in the chaos of command, when leaders tried to hold the line in the face of uncertainty. She recognized it instantly. A soft chime echoed through the cabin, followed by the faint rustle of movement as one of the flight attendants appeared from the galley. Her smile was tight, professional, but her steps were too quick, her eyes scanning rows rather than passengers. The woman noticed how her hand brushed the overhead panel, a small, almost subconscious gesture, as if confirming something. Across the aisle, a man tried to lighten the mood with a joke, but it died mid-sentence when the plane tilted slightly to one side. The flight path wasn't smooth anymore. It was cautious, deliberate, as though they were weaving through something unseen. The woman leaned closer to the window, peering into the storm that swirled outside. Raindrops streaked across the glass like tracer fire in the dark, and through the rolling clouds, she caught flashes of faint, rhythmic lights far below, not lightning, but a signal. Her mind raced, connecting dots that shouldn't have existed in a commercial flight. She knew those formation patterns. They weren't natural. They were tactical. A soft metallic click drew her attention back inside the cabin. One of the rear service doors had been manually checked, twice. The attendants whispered urgently, voices barely audible over the engine's drone. The passengers, sensing the tension, began to murmur among themselves. A child started crying somewhere in the back, and the sound sliced through the cabin's uneasy silence. The woman unbuckled her belt slightly, leaning forward, her senses sharpened. She could feel the shift, the kind that always came before an order, before chaos erupted. Then, like the flick of a switch, the lights went out. Gasps filled the cabin, followed by the sound of oxygen masks dropping halfway from their compartments before retracting again. A few screams pierced the air. Within seconds, the backup lights kicked in, bathing the interior in a dull red glow that made everything look surreal. Faces pale, eyes wide, fear painted in every expression. The intercom buzzed, static filling the silence before the captain's voice emerged. "Please stay calm. We're handling a temporary electrical malfunction." But the woman didn't believe it. The voice had changed. It wasn't the same man. The cadence was off, too firm, too military. She'd heard that tone in briefing rooms, not cockpits. Someone new had taken control. Her suspicion was confirmed moments later when the cabin door opened and two figures stepped out. One in the uniform of a flight officer, the other in plain clothes, but with a stance that gave him away immediately. Shoulders squared, gaze locked, every movement efficient. The kind of posture that didn't come from flight school. It came from training fields and covert missions. He wasn't a regular pilot. He was military. And judging by the insignia patch barely visible under his jacket, he wasn't just any soldier. He was a SEAL. The room went still. The attendants froze mid-step, and the passengers fell silent, the hum of the engines filling the void between heartbeats. The SEAL moved calmly, assessing, scanning. Then his gaze landed on her. Recognition flashed in his eyes, brief but unmistakable. That single moment changed everything. He walked toward her without hesitation, kneeling slightly beside her seat, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "We don't have much time," he said. "There's something under this plane that doesn't belong here." Her blood ran cold. He didn't need to say the word. She already knew what it was. A device, hidden, silent, waiting. The storm outside was just a disguise for something far deadlier. "Who?" she managed to ask, her voice barely a whisper. He shook his head. "We're not sure. But whoever it is, they knew we'd be on this route." The weight of his words sank in. This wasn't random. It was targeted. The SEAL's eyes flicked toward the cockpit, where a faint shadow moved behind the door. "We have to divert. Now," he said, rising to his feet. But before he could move further, the intercom crackled again, and a distorted voice filled the cabin. It wasn't the captain, and it wasn't the co-pilot. "Everyone stays seated," the voice ordered. "This plane is not changing course." The SEAL froze, exchanging a sharp glance with the woman. The voice was cold, deliberate, with an accent that didn't belong to any of the crew. Gasps erupted from the passengers as realization spread. The plane had been compromised. Somewhere among them, or worse, inside the cockpit, was someone who had taken control. The woman's training kicked in. She wasn't a soldier, but she wasn't ordinary either. Years of experience working alongside operatives had taught her how to read tension, how to find calm in chaos. She stood slowly, steadying herself against the seat. "Tell me what to do," she said. The SEAL's eyes met hers, surprised for only a second before he nodded. "Follow my lead," he whispered, moving toward the cockpit with controlled precision. Every step was measured, every sound magnified by the tension in the air. The passengers watched in terrified silence as he approached the door. The woman followed, her pulse racing, but her expression unreadable. Outside, lightning streaked across the clouds again, illuminating the wings in harsh white light. The plane shuddered, a deep metallic groan vibrating through the floor as the pressure shifted. The intercom buzzed once more, and the same voice spoke, this time lower, almost mocking. "You shouldn't have stood up." The SEAL reached for the cockpit handle, his jaw tightening. The woman's breath caught as the light above the door flashed red. Somewhere deep within the aircraft, a silent countdown had already begun. The moment he heard her name, time seemed to slow. The SEAL pilot, still seated in the cockpit, froze as the attendant's voice echoed over the comms. The name he hadn't heard in years, spoken so casually, unaware of what it carried. His hand, steady even under the most brutal conditions, trembled slightly against the throttle. His co-pilot noticed the shift in his breathing, but didn't ask. The silence in the cockpit suddenly felt heavier than the storm clouds around them. Outside, lightning tore through the sky, painting brief flashes of white across his visor, and for a split second, he saw her face, the same calm defiance she had shown the last time their paths had crossed. He'd spent his career flying into danger, extracting teams under fire, navigating terrains most would call suicidal. But this was different. The name belonged to someone from a chapter he thought he'd buried. Someone who had once saved his life without ever knowing his full story. And now, By some twist of fate, she was on his plane, sitting just a few rows behind the cockpit door, unaware that the man flying her across the clouds was the same one she had rescued years ago. The comms crackled again, dragging him back to the present. "Captain, turbulence increasing. Do we need to reroute?" His co-pilot's voice sounded distant, muffled. He responded automatically, his tone calm, but his mind was racing. A denied first-class upgrade. That's what they had said when she boarded. He remembered watching her from the cockpit cameras as she walked down the aisle, grace hidden behind quiet disappointment. He'd seen passengers like her before, the ones who carried themselves with quiet dignity even when wronged. But now he realized there had been more to it. He switched the internal feed, zooming in on the cabin view. The screen flickered before stabilizing on her face. She was seated by the window, staring into the clouds, completely unaware that the pilot watching her had once bled under her command. He took a deep breath, steadying his voice as he spoke to air traffic control. But beneath the professional calm, his thoughts drifted to that night years ago, the desert mission, the wreckage, the gunfire, and the medic who refused to leave him behind. The woman who had pulled him from the sand when everyone else thought he was gone. His chest tightened as the memory played behind his eyes, the same determined look in her face when she'd bandaged his arm, her voice steady over the chaos, her words short and firm. "You're not dying here." He had never forgotten them. And now, here she was again, unknowingly seated behind him, while another storm raged outside. "Sir," the co-pilot said again, sensing his distraction. "Everything okay?" He nodded. "Fine. Just focus on the radar." But the tension in his tone was impossible to hide. He could hear the faint static of the military frequency still active in the background, a line he had left open just in case. It was supposed to be a civilian flight, no classified missions, no covert signals. Yet something had triggered the encrypted channel mid-flight. That wasn't coincidence. The instruments flickered. Altitude steady. Fuel normal. Yet the external sensors were reading anomalies, faint heat signatures below their flight path, the kind that belonged to ground radar tracking systems. He didn't like it. He'd flown enough covert routes to know when something was watching. And if it was, this wasn't random. Someone wanted this plane monitored. He looked again at her through the small feed. She hadn't moved. Her eyes were calm, her hand resting near the seatbelt clasp as if she was waiting for something. He could almost feel it, the same awareness he'd seen on the battlefield. She knew something was off. The SEAL pilot leaned back, his mind locking into mission focus. He wasn't just a pilot anymore. Instinct took over. He replayed everything that had happened since boarding. The gate delay, the passenger manifest change, the denied upgrade, the sudden storm. None of it lined up. The woman's name wasn't just random in the passenger list. It was inserted. Someone had placed her here, deliberately. And if that was true, the threat wasn't just outside. It was on board. He turned off the autopilot and gripped the controls manually. "I need you to take over comms," he told the co-pilot. "I'm going to check something." The co-pilot hesitated, confused. "Sir, in this weather, just do it." His tone left no room for argument. He unstrapped and stood, the hum of the engines vibrating through the floor beneath his boots. With every step toward the door, the memories became sharper. The sandstorm, the gunfire, the sound of her voice commanding calm under chaos. He could still feel the pain of that day, the gratitude that had never found words. When he reached the cockpit door, he paused. The passengers beyond had no idea that their pilot wasn't just navigating turbulence. He was walking straight back into a past that refused to stay buried. He opened the door quietly, the sound of the cabin filling the narrow space. She looked up for the first time, and for a brief second, her eyes locked with his. Recognition hit them both, not through words, but through the silence that carried every unspoken memory between them. He didn't smile. He didn't explain. He just looked at her and said, quietly but firmly, "You might want to come with me." The passengers around her turned, confused, their curiosity mixing with fear as the pilot, a man who looked too calm for the chaos around them, extended his hand toward her seat. And in that single moment, before anyone could process what was happening, the boundaries of class, rank, and protocol vanished. The woman denied a first-class seat had just been invited into the cockpit, not out of courtesy, but because she was the only one the SEAL trusted when things went wrong. The cockpit was dimly lit, the glow of the instrument panels washing the walls in muted blue and amber tones. The storm outside roared like a living thing, flashes of lightning carving brief, blinding streaks through the darkness. Inside, the woman stood just behind the pilot's chair, her reflection faintly visible in the curved glass of the windshield. The SEAL pilot's hands moved with precision across the controls, his expression calm but unreadable. The tension between them wasn't spoken, but it filled every inch of that narrow space. A tension born from recognition, trust, and the silent weight of shared history. The co-pilot had been sent out moments earlier, under the pretense of checking with the attendants. That left the two of them alone, surrounded by the hum of machines and the faint crackle of military-coded static that still echoed through the radio. She glanced down at the radar screen, small blips pulsing on the edge of detection range. "Those aren't civilian frequencies," she said quietly. He nodded without looking up. "No, they're not. And they've been following us since we crossed the coastline." Her mind worked quickly, piecing together the fragments she'd observed since boarding. The gate delay, the sudden reroute, the mechanical checks that hadn't made sense. "They wanted us in the air during the storm," she said, her voice low. "Visibility drops, radar gets interference. Easy to hide something." He adjusted the altitude, eyes sharp on the instruments. "Or someone," he replied. The cabin lights flickered again, briefly dimming before returning to their soft glow. Below, thunder rolled like distant artillery fire. For a long moment, neither spoke. The air was heavy with the kind of silence that only soldiers understood, not fear, but readiness. The kind that waits for the world to make its next move before deciding whether to strike or survive. Finally, he exhaled. "You know," he said softly, still focused ahead, "when they told me your name was on the passenger list, I thought it was a mistake. You were supposed to be done with this life." She gave a small, hollow smile. "So were you." Their eyes met briefly, and in that fleeting connection, every unspoken truth resurfaced. They both knew the cost of walking away from that world, and how easily it could pull you back in. A sudden alarm blared on the panel, a proximity alert. He silenced it instantly, leaning forward. "We've got company," he said. On the radar, one of the blips had moved closer, too close for coincidence. Could be a drone, maybe surveillance grade. Military signature. She leaned closer, her voice steady. "If they're tracking us, they're not here to observe. They're confirming position before interception." He didn't answer. Instead, he toggled a hidden switch under the panel, and a secondary display flickered to life. One that didn't belong to civilian aircraft systems. It showed encrypted military channels, the kind only active operatives would recognize. Her breath caught when she saw it. "You're still linked," she said. He nodded. "You never really retire from the SEALs. Not when you've got unfinished business." The hum of the engines deepened as he pushed the throttle forward slightly. The plane angled through the storm, wings slicing through turbulence like a blade through smoke. She steadied herself against the seat, the vibration humming through her fingertips. Outside, the storm clouds shifted, and through a break in the darkness, she saw it, a faint light in the distance, steady, deliberate, and moving parallel to their path. "There," she whispered. He followed her gaze, eyes narrowing. "That's not lightning." He adjusted course sharply. Passengers in the cabin gasped as the plane tilted. But up here, there was no panic, only calculation. Every turn, every shift of altitude was measured to stay unpredictable. The light in the distance adjusted again, matching their movement. "They're locked on," she said. "Whoever they are, they know who's on this flight." He didn't respond, just tightened his grip on the yoke. The thunder outside drowned out the faint clicking of the instruments. His breathing steadied, eyes flicking across the displays, reading data most wouldn't understand. She recognized that focus, the kind born in combat, where seconds decide everything. Then, through the static of the comms, a voice broke through, scrambled, distorted, but chillingly clear in intent. "You're off course, Commander. Return to route." The woman's eyes widened. They had used his old call sign, a name buried in classified records. A name no one outside his old unit should have known. He froze for half a second, his jaw tightening. The comms went silent again, leaving only the whine of the wind outside. "They know you," she said quietly. He gave a small nod. "They know us." The storm outside intensified, the lightning flashing so close that it illuminated the cockpit like a camera flash. In that brief light, she saw the resolve on his face harden. He switched the radio channel, overriding civilian frequencies. "This is Commander Slate," he said into the mic. "You've made your point. Now tell me what you want." Static answered him. Then, slowly, a different voice came through. Lower, calmer, and far too familiar. "You shouldn't have brought her." The woman stiffened. Her pulse spiked. She knew that voice. It belonged to someone who wasn't supposed to be alive. The realization struck them both at once. This wasn't random interception. This was personal. The SEAL's hand tightened on the controls as he looked at her. "You still trust me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. She didn't hesitate. "Always." It wasn't a statement of comfort. It was a contract, one forged years ago in sand, blood, and silence. He nodded once, then pulled a switch under the console, something hidden beneath the standard flight system. A red light glowed faintly, and a subtle shift in the plane's pitch followed. The engines roared louder, climbing. "What are you doing?" she asked. "Ending it," he said simply, eyes locked forward. The radar's blips began to scatter, fading into static as the storm thickened around them. The cockpit trembled with the surge of power. The world outside turned white with light and noise, and in that storm, two people, bound by past and purpose, faced the sky together.